Wood. She has her book with us. It's the first ebook published by Autonomy, a digital imprint of HarperCollins Publishers, and later released by HarperCollins 360 as a global print version. She was born in Los Angeles, raised in Lancaster, California. High Desert is kind of her home stomping grounds. She graduated from the University of Denver, lived in Chicago for 5 years, where she completed an MA in English at DePaul University. She has appeared as a panelist and a speaker at the Southern California Writers Conference, Left Coast Crime, and Butcher Con. Am I saying that right, or am I butchering that? Is it close? Okay. I'll let you straighten that out if I messed it up. She lives in Southern California with her husband and 4 children, and she brought one of her 4 children, Geneva, here to put her to work during this time. But we're very fortunate to have her, and we welcome you, Mary.
Good morning. Get used to this. Well, I don't think it's fair that I had to follow those 3 comedians at the front. Nobody told me that would happen. I don't have any jokes. I might have a few. When Dwight first contacted me about coming out to meet you all, and I heard this chapter was called The High Desert Branch, I told him I'll feel right at home. Although I'm noticing as I sit here that my blood has thinned a little living in Orange County. I'm like freezing. And this happens to me every time I go visit my mom. My mom and my brother are still in Lancaster. And I go, around the holiday time and I forget. It's like 30 degrees at night, But anyway, so Lancaster, is sort of a cousin or a neighbor to Apple Valley. We probably played Apple Valley in high school. My grandfather on the Vensel side came to the area to work at Edwards Air Force Base as a flight instructor and later for NASA. And my other grandpa came, like many people, for the opportunities to be an entrepreneur, and he had an auto electric shop. And I went to Catholic high school until my senior year, not because I got kicked out, but just because I was a moody teenager, and I ended up graduating from Antelope Valley High School. So my roots are deep in the desert. And because I spend so much time holed up at my computer, as I'm sure you can all relate, it's always a pleasure to get out and meet people. And if those people are writers, well, that's even better. I don't think that I can think of a group that's more quietly, determined and excited than writers about books and reading and writing. So your membership and participation here means that you've already figured out how important it is to have a writing tribe. I'm going to talk today about editing, and certainly we all have our own approaches and processes. Whenever I attend a conference or a writing event, in addition to the opportunity for socializing and commiserating, because we all have our gripes, right? I always hope to leave with at least, just a few ideas, a couple of tips, maybe some inspiration. And so I hope, you'll leave with some of that today. So while I'll be talking about the 4 levels of editing and giving you some suggestions about how to attack each one, I hope to also encourage. Because amidst all the isolation, right, the rejection, the missed parties, we actually have been given a remarkable gift. And if we can remind ourselves what a joy it is and what a pleasure to be able to lose yourself in that creative process, that's always helpful. So, the editing process, or as I like to call it, the real work. Hopefully, most of us have experienced that feeling when you write or type the final page of a first draft. Weeks have gone into it, months, maybe years, as you devised and constructed your manuscript, and now it's finished, right? Finished. Wrong. Well, all of us know that's not true. The completion of the first draft is certainly a great milestone, but there's a long, long road ahead. Remember when you first started writing? I was pretty young. Maybe it was bad poetry, short stories. Or maybe you dove right into the longer stuff, and editing was not really part of your repertoire. Everything seemed so perfect the way it issued out, right? And if in a rare moment you shared it with someone and they suggested that maybe you could change something, well, that just taught you not to share anymore, right? But now you're a seasoned writer, manuscripts under your belt, Maybe you even have published something, you go to conferences, you're in this writer's club, you're an expert. And yet still you struggle with editing because so much of our work is done alone. I mean, it's great to have critique partners, but most of the time, you're alone with your work. And maybe you know what you should be doing, or maybe you don't, but either way, getting yourself to focus, to follow through, to make more than just a few marks on each read through, well, it isn't always easy. The English writer Muriel Spark had very specific writing habits. She wrote everything in longhand with certain pencils in special notebooks that she ordered from a stationer in Edinburgh. She gave an interview later in her career, and she said the printer who made her special notebooks was going out of business, and she only had 2 left, so she would have to quit writing. She also claimed to do little, if any, editing. Her quote is, "I do 1 draft. I do the editing in my head first. I very seldom change paragraphs and things around. I heard that it's very useful for people who do move things about to have a computer, but it wouldn't suit me because I just write on." Well, most of us don't work that way, although that sounds pretty nice, actually. Just a few notes about my notebook. As Dwight said, I do have degrees in English, not in creative writing. So when I started writing, everything I knew about it came from the process of reading and deconstructing fiction, which is something I still enjoy, and I do book reviews from time to time. I took 1 creative writing class as an undergrad, and I don't remember liking it very well, but probably because I was in that early phase of not liking to share. I wrote some prose poetry, I did short stories, I wrote an autobiographical first novel, as we all must, right? And the book that actually got published, The Qualities of Wood, was actually my second completed novel. It was written over 20 years ago and published in 2014. But my publication story, which is kind of unique, is a different story that I can answer questions about later if you want. As for formal creative writing training, I actually took my very first writing workshop this year. I was lucky enough to be chosen for a workshop led by the acclaimed writer Richard Bausch. It was held at Chapman, and it was a wonderful experience, and I'll probably reference it a little bit today. So, up until just a few years ago, here's kind of what my editing process looked like. I would finish something, a book, a novel, and I would print the entire thing out. I'd put it in a folder, maybe something like this, right? And that in itself is kind of satisfying. Looks like a book, it's thick, it's weighty, it's substantial. And at some point, maybe the next day, maybe a few days later, I would sit down at a table or a desk, get a cup of tea, my red pen, my book, and be ready to edit. Maybe I have some notes, a couple things I was going to look for, problems ranging from superficial to maybe bigger things dealing with the very nature of the book. So, these random thoughts are there, bouncing around in some corner of your brain as you begin. Things like, my main character is kind of aloof and unsympathetic, and I think his wife has come across as too cold. You may be aware of some surface level stuff that needs attention. Grammar, overuse of certain words. Maybe you were using too many semicolons at the time. You were having some kind of phase. So, broader things. Does the book attack the themes in the way that you had hoped? So already, you sit down with your book, you've identified some problems, big and small. I'm feeling pretty industrious as I sit down with my pen and my cup and my thinking cap. Turn to page 1 and begin reading. Well, lucky you, your story opens with some beautifully rendered scenery, and you're immediately transported by your prose. You begin to feel that whoosh of creation, the tingling you felt when you created each wonderful phrase. Halfway down the page, your character comes in, feeling, bereft, and the same hopelessness washes over you. You're being transported by your creation, you begin to see what he's seeing, feel what he's feeling. Oh, you do notice a typo, so you mark that. Keep reading. You start anticipating the next scene, thinking about it. You're getting sucked into that process when you wrote it. It's a great thing. You do notice a word that maybe you don't want to use that word, you want to use another word. And you keep reading, and 10 pages later, you call it quits for the day. And you're happy and you're sad. You're happy because there's little glimmers of wonderfulness over your writing. You're very proud of yourself. But you're sad too. You're sad because you're frustrated, distracted by all these thoughts. You've forgotten about those character notes. You even forgot to look for semicolons. back to square one, back to page one. Maybe tomorrow I'll use a purple pen, and that will, help me out. Or worse yet, and this actually happened to me last week, I pulled out something that was old, and you read a page or two, and you see so many issues, you don't know where to start. You think, this is terrible, which is probably why I haven't looked at that thing in a year. But the process of editing is tedious. A big job like cleaning out your garage or, calling to restructure your cable bill, and it should be done in chunks over time. Most importantly, editing needs to be done in different ways on different levels, and dividing and conquering these levels is the only way. This will require a variety of approaches with tools that help you train yourself to see your manuscript in new eyes. So today I'm going to talk about the different levels of editing which mimic the routine followed by publishers, and what to look for once you're in the process for each level. Then I want to talk about how to get yourself to make these changes and give you hopefully some suggestions of things to try, if the cup of tea, the red pen are not working. I like bullet points, I like instructions, I like an organized plan that you can break things down. How can you force, direct, and sometimes even fool yourself into doing what's good for you in your book? So I think there are 3, maybe 4 levels of editing. And you can do them in any order, at any time, but you have to do them separately. The first one is what I would call copy editing, proofreading. When you're doing this type of editing, you want to read briskly. This is where you're looking for the superficial things, grammar, typos, punctuation. For me, this type of editing can be relatively mindless, probably because of those English degrees. They're good for something, It doesn't require deep concentration or a quiet place necessarily. You want to look at the actual prose on a superficial level. If you decided to use any word fonts, of course these things could be changed later, but if you decided to use, for instance, italics for interior monologue, you're not going to use quotation marks for dialogue, things like that. And also just grammar. Go through it quickly, scanning for mistakes, but also note your natural reactions. Are the italics distracting? Do you have trouble knowing who is speaking? Things like that. Watch for repetitions, either the same word or 2 similar words used in proximity, words that you're overusing. You'll notice if you're reading quickly, for example, that you describe one character as greedy, and then a couple sentences down, you painted a lovely metaphor about a storm drain, swallowing water greedily. These are things that will come to light in a quick read. Watch for adverbs, too many adjectives. Voltaire said the adjective is the enemy of the noun. I don't know about that, but you definitely want to not overuse. Passivity, this is a big one, passivity, where there could be activity in terms of phrasing. Your character should mostly be doing things instead of having things done to them. On grammar, just a note, just as a house needs a good foundation, good writing needs a solid understanding of language and its use. If you weren't an English major and punctuation, grammar, things like that are not your strength, get help and study. You should justify the use of anything other than said for dialogue attribution. People will disagree, some with this, like she declared, he grunted, he replied. 9.5 times out of 10 said is just fine. This is my opinion. I'm not saying you absolutely shouldn't use these variations. I'm just saying you shouldn't use them. So, mostly, I will use one now and then, but almost always it's for effect. There's this very specific reason why I'm doing it. Ask any writer, though, what their own personal pet peeve words, and they might tell you some of these. And these are all words I know we look for to cut. Very, rather, really, quite, so, of course, in fact. My own personal pet peeve is that. I think the word that is something that we use when we're writing, but we don't use when we're speaking. So it almost always can come out and tighten up sentences. Look for problems on this first level of editing with point of view and tense. I'm not going to get into any big discussion why you chose your point of view, but obviously it should be consistent. Think about it on a superficial level at this point, making sure the verbs line up. This is a proofreading level. Think of it as if a friend has asked you to check a speech they've written for errors. As bookish types, we've all been asked this kind of favor, and you know and I know that your friend does not want you to tell them that they've chosen the wrong angle for the speech. They really just want you to look for grammar mistakes and things that are glaring, because you're the expert, right? My very favorite quote about editing comes from Oscar Wilde, and he said, "I have been correcting the proofs of my poems. In the morning, after hard work, I took a comma out of one sentence, and in the afternoon, I put it back in." Which is what it seems like sometimes, right? So the second level of editing is what I would call the making sense or the practical editing. Here's where you want to address slightly broader concerns, ignore commas and semicolons, read a bit more slowly, looking for things that don't make sense, as if you're reading an essay and you're going to have to answer questions about it later. For example, time and place logistics. Someone was in a car and now they're in the house and we are not following how that happened. Watch your characters move through the world and make sure it's all making sense. Look for places where you've over-explained emotions or settings or spoke when your character could be the one speaking. Are there sections where your own interest wanders while reading? And this is one of the hardest things to acknowledge, right? When you're reading your own book and there's a part where you think, this is so boring. I'm not even interested in reading this myself. Elmore Leonard's famous quote, "I leave out the parts that people skip." And he does. Those long asides about the proper way to groom a horse or something. I know you researched it. I know you're proud of yourself. I know it's hard to let go of it, but think again about point of view and tense, but from a making sense standpoint. For example, this is a sentence that bugs me. As she turned away from the window, she touched the collar of her dress and placed the gilded dagger on the table. Now, grammatically speaking, that as she turned away from the window, that's a clause that means that that's happening while everything else is happening. And maybe no one will follow me on this, but to be turning away from a window and touching your collar and putting a dagger, like it's all, you know what I mean? As it's grammatically presented, it bothers me. Like that's not realistic that all of that's going on at once. And these are things in that more making sense level when you read it. You have to be looking for, like I said, your character moving through the world, making sure, does that make sense that she would be touching that and doing that? Things like that. Dialogue. Focus on what is said. Dialogue should always be serving more than one function. Rambling dialogue. And it's another example of where fiction doesn't necessarily represent life, because we do have boring conversations. Hello, how are you this morning? I'm doing fine. How are you doing this morning? Dialogue in fiction should be always serving something else. Hello, he said, and he glanced at the skirt that she was wearing from yesterday. Or, something like that. There should always be something. Dialogue should never be just filler. It should always be working very hard. Does narration sneak into your character's thoughts? Does your 12-year-old character have thoughts that are appropriate to him? Interior monologue, easy to spot if you've kept it in italics, which, hint, hint, you shouldn't. If there's too much of it, it slows the action. If it's too little, your reader might feel a distance from the character. Recognize the beats in your prose. I think everyone probably knows what beats are. It's just kind of a natural rhythm or timing in the prose. This is something you'll notice when you're especially reading out loud. Anachronisms, errors in research, facts you need to check. Outside readers are great for this. In my book, early on, I had a little section where I talked about lions, something with a nature program, and someone very nicely told me that lions don't do what I said, and they don't live where I said they lived. So that's always outside readers are good for that. Think about repetition, not just certain words, but things like plot points. Are you reminding about something that happened that, when it wasn't necessary? Have you overdone something? The act of figuring things out is an enjoyable part of reading, so don't take that away from your readers. As we all know, writing 4 pages can take like 3 hours, right? But you can read them in 5 minutes or less. So just by reading at this slower paces, you'll be able to catch things. Reading at a normal pace will highlight many issues in this practical level. Think of this level as if you're grading the essay of a high school student. You're trying to teach the proper mechanics and the rudimentary aspects of storytelling, but without being too smarty pants about it, right? Does A connect to B? Does it make sense? Where is there rambling? Ignore the typos if you can, commas, and we'll get into how to kind of make yourself do this. Pretend that you have a copy editor to do that for you later. Actually, you don't. It's going to be you. At this level, you're just looking to make sense. So the third level of editing is what I would call the big picture. People would call it developmental Editing, it's the good stuff, it's also the hard stuff. If you're a writer of fiction, right, this is where you live. You get to examine some of your initial inspirations, story, theme, characters. This is where your heart is. These are the hardest edits to see and the hardest to make. And I'll get into a little more of this about when I get into how, but think about your characters as people. Are they realistic? Are they believable, likable, etc.? What happens in the book in terms of traditional plot? Are you pleased with the conclusion, the pace? Are there ideas that are underdeveloped? Do the themes add and build appropriately? These are the larger kind of issues. In terms of voice, do you hear the artistic voice you were hoping for? Are there lingering questions at the end? And if so, are you okay with leaving it that way? There's so much we can say about this level. Stephen King, in his wonderful book on writing, called On Writing, said, when you write a book, you spend day after day scanning and identifying the trees, but when you're done, you have to step back and look at the forest. And this is where the editing gets difficult. You sat down with that red pen, and you were so busy taking out commas and putting them back in that you don't notice that middle section that completely stalls out, or the character that is suddenly a different person than he was in the beginning without an explanation. This is the level that may require the most help with how to do it, and hopefully I'll give you some ideas. Think of this level as though you're having a conversation with your favorite, most respected writer. What things would you say your book is about? Have you created realistic characters? What have you tried to do in terms of technique and artistry? Or maybe even, if you're feeling very proud of yourself, what have you tried to add to the world's literary conversation by writing this novel? This is a level that you should hope to get to with workshop friends, because it's very helpful to have people find commas and typos for you, but really to tap into other writers and their broad reading experiences with these major creative considerations is very helpful. So I said at the beginning that I thought there were 3, possibly 4 levels of editing. And if you choose to accept the mission, then the 4th level would be what I would call the get to business level. This is where you're going to put on your publisher hat and think about the structure of the book as a whole. What kind of book is it? Should it be longer? Should it be shorter? Especially in this, time when a lot of people are becoming entrepreneurs, self-publishing is a much more attractive option for a lot of people. You have to be able to kind of look at the book on a market level. In the workshop I took with Mr. Bausch, a lot of people would submit novel excerpts, but some people would do short stories, and he's very well known for his short stories. He's written over 20 books. He's in his 70s now, and just really an expert. But he would be reading someone's short story, and he would say, now I see the story is about 14 pages. It really should be about 20. And we would kind of look at each other like, that's a weird thing to say. Or he'd say, this really needs to be a good 5 pages longer, and maybe 6. And we all thought that was kind of funny, but the funny thing is, now that I'm still kind of workshopping with some of the people in the class, and I read other people's stories, I'm starting to kind of think that way too. Not that I'm becoming an expert like him, but I do sometimes think, this story needs to be about 5 pages longer, because it needs to build this character, it needs another scene, and that's kind of this sort of business level where you're going to look at your book, your novel, and kind of match it with what's out there already published in the genre and see how it measures up. And by this I mean all kinds of levels. Look at the pages. Is there a lot of black narrative, little dialogue? Is there a nice variety in structure? Are the paragraphs all the same length? Are the chapters long? Are the chapters short? Is the pace consistent with others in the genre? Think about how you assess a book when you're at the bookstore. I usually pick up a book, I look at the front cover, the back cover. I'm not a first page reader. I go to the middle, and you can tell right away, right? Is it a chatty book with a lot of speaking, a dense book? Is it going to be a light read, a quick read? Of course, there's readers for all of these types of writing, but just kind of be aware of what you're doing and whether or not it fits into current genre norms. All that being said, my own feeling is that a lot of the following everything and writing advice is kind of sucking the soul out of creative spirit. So I know I'm saying 2 things at once, things like introduce your character's goals and conflicts on the first page, right? That's something we've all heard a million times. Set off running, start with a fast pace, show, don't tell. Samuel Johnson said, "Your manuscript is both good and original, but the part that is good is not original, and the part that is original is not good." So, I don't know if that's true. In a book I have that's still unpublished, I opened with this. It was a very inspirational part of why I even wrote this book. I opened with kind of this film panorama, and it was set in Chicago, and it kind of zoomed around the city and then came into a building and to the main character. Now this thing lasted like, I don't know, a page and a half, and it was beautiful, I thought. And I had a lot of early readers that would be, "Oh my gosh, that film thing, I really, I didn't know where that was going. I was so glad when it was over." And I thought, gosh, people are so impatient, like it was a page. Like, let me do this for a page, instead of just getting into write, here's the character. So writing, I think, always straddles the line between staying true to yourself and finding readers, of course. Nora Joyce once said to her husband, "Why don't you write books people can read?" Just a thought, So the fact is, you don't write in a vacuum. If most readers don't like it, you're going to have to probably going to have to go. And this holds true of my lovely film panorama, although for now I have shortened it, but I'm clinging to it. But, it is unpublished. So I guess what I'm saying, when you hit the 4th level of editing, and you have to think about things like market and genre, don't let current conventions necessarily suck the soul right out of you. Many books that have taken the world by storm did so because they were something new, something untried, something outside of those norms. Doris Lessing said, "There's no laws for the novel, never have been, nor can there ever be." So those are the levels of editing, and if you leave with one thing today, know that you have to address it one level at a time in any order. I don't think there's any effective way you can focus on thematic concerns at the same time you're looking at your verbs to make sure they all line up, or trying to build a character a little bit. So what about the how? How do we avoid that process I described earlier, wherein we try to edit, but we get transported by the sheer genius of our gift? What are some methods? How do I force myself out of my usual, fairly unproductive editing habits? So one piece of advice you'll hear again and again and again in terms of editing is that when you get that first draft done, put it in a drawer and don't look at it for a while. And that's true. If you and your manuscript want to have a healthy, long-term relationship, sometimes you have to take some time off, right? Zadie Smith once said, "You should put it away for a year." And all the writers that read that, trying to make a living, were like, "Yeah, right, no problem, a whole year." Easy for you, Zadie Smith. But sadly, it's true. Nothing will make you see your novel in a new light than time. If you don't have time, then give yourself distance, geographic, mental, whatever it takes. And that can be very simple. Get away from the area where you work on the book. Don't carry it around with you in any form, mental or physical. Start something new. Throw your mental energies into notes for a new story or project. Clean your house. Fire up Netflix. Read. Preferably something far away from whatever genre you were working in. What most people don't realize about writers is that we're always writing, right? Even when we're not. So, especially after you've just been completely immersed in something, it's very difficult to get out of it. I felt almost depressed after finishing something where I really was, involved with the characters. But you need to fire up your brain cells with something else. While you're taking a break from your relationship with your novel, it's a very good time to see other people. Bring in some help. For the health of your relationship, you and your manuscript need outside readers. All types of readers are helpful, but what you really want are critical ones. People whose opinions you respect. I'm assuming as members of the club, you've got critique groups and you're exchanging work, and that's so valuable. So now that you get yourself some time and distraction, you've got your notes, you're ready to dive back in. Separate your concerns into level and decide which one you're going to attack. Maybe your current schedule will dictate. If I'm going to be sitting at the doctor's office, I can grab something and proofread. It's sort of mindless. If I've got a week set aside where I'm really going to have some time to get into it, then maybe I can get into some deeper issues. When you get ready to read your manuscript, think about how. I find that if I have it the way I described, in pen and paper, my kind of school teacher mode sets in, and I'm much more likely to start doing copy editing type stuff. A change in scenery affects me profoundly, even if it's just, as I said, moving from my upstairs work area to downstairs. Leaving the house is even better. A manuscript always looks different to me in different places. This is why people have offices outside their home. in those nice little, what are those little mini sheds in the back now. You can write at the coffee shop, shake up your routine. If you usually work on your desktop computer, grab a laptop and go somewhere. I know it sounds silly, but it will look different to you, I promise. If you don't already have an e-reader, think about getting one. Even if you're one of the as a tool for your writing, this little device has helped me with editing in a big way, and I'll tell you why. When I'm reading something on my Kindle, it looks like a published book, and it forces me to look at it this way. I can't write in red ink on the screen. It feels like a final draft, and so I'm able to read and look for broader issues. I can notice how the chapters flow together, how characters develop, things like that. E-readers are great for sharing manuscripts with other writers, and for literally, seeing your book side by side with other books. So whatever your routine is, change it. If you like to go through your manuscript on the computer, print it out. If you've marked up those pages beyond recognition, send the latest version to your Kindle. Take it to the library, the park, someplace you might just take a book you're reading and just read it. I know you can make bookmarks and things on a Kindle, but I don't. I might make notes on the side or something. So here's another idea I sort of stumbled upon on a vacation. I had several books I wanted to read, and a couple unpublished things by friends, and then at the end of all that, I also wanted to go through my book and read it. So I loaded everything onto my Kindle, and I'm a fast reader, so I read a couple books, and by the end of the week, it just so happened everything was kind of in similar genres. I read a lot of literary fiction, there was some commercial fiction, a little bit of mystery. I read a few things, that weren't mine, and then, I've got 2 days left, let me get into my book. And it was really helpful to help me notice how mine was similar and not similar to those others. It was kind of a little reading marathon. Because I was doing so much reading and I had only those 7 days, I just kind of started reading my book at a normal, quick pace, and I was able to be much more critical, I think, than if I had kind of sat down independently and, okay, now I'm going to edit. I just went right into it. This is a great method for looking at level 3 and 4 editing, the broader concerns of story, character theme, and how the book compares to others. Another piece of advice you'll hear a lot, read out loud. I know we've all heard it. Yes, it matters. Don't cheat. Don't do that sort of half-whisper thing where you catch yourself. You're not really reading out loud. Read out loud. Read slowly. This method will help you a lot with things like rhythms and beats, whether or not your dialogue is realistic. If your dialogue sounds silly as you say it out loud, then it's probably silly. If you're tempted to jot down changes while you're reading, do it. You should trust your instincts 100% when you're reading out loud. It's great for finding level 2 type edits, things that don't make sense, places that are worded awkwardly, sections that are boring. A variant of this method would be to make a recording of yourself or have someone read it for you. This can give you more valuable distance. When my book came out, I did a little audio piece for an online site, and listening to that recording was kind of a unique experience too. It definitely gave a level of distance that helped you hear it in a new light. One of the favorite parts for everyone in that Bausch workshop was when Mr. Bausch would read part of our story. He has a wonderful Tennessee accent, which of course I can't do, but everybody loved that part, and towards the end of the workshop we had to stop doing it because we were running out of time. We had to cover more stories, and everyone was like, because it was so wonderful. So if you're in a workshop, one thing I definitely would recommend is having someone else read your story for you, because that really just gives a new light for you. Role-playing is suggested to me by another writer, and this is where you read aloud, but you're imagining different audiences. For instance, if you imagine that you're reading your book to a group of readers, you might accentuate things more like plot or parts that are funny. If you imagine that you're reading your book to a group of writers, you might just naturally kind of accentuate some of the more stylistic elements. That's, like I said, that was suggested to me by another writer, and it kind of makes sense. It's just, again, trying to get yourself to think of tools and ways to look at it in a different way, which is hard. So working at the third level, the big stuff, story, theme, character, sometimes it's really helpful to develop specific goals and focus on that. Break down the slippery, deep thought considerations into practical tasks. Maybe some of your readers told you that your character's unlikable, which did happen to me in my book, and that his actions at the end didn't seem to make sense with what they knew of him. Well, you could explore this by editing on your computer. So you have a problem and then put your mind to thinking of some tools or some ways that you can attack it. On the computer, you can easily search the character's name and jump to each scene he's in. Now, maybe if you're an outliner, you already have some of this work done. Chapter by chapter, you could write down clues to the character's development. Maybe some kind of chart, what we know about him, what he tells us about himself. Write down what information is relayed in each chapter, and maybe by looking at it in kind of a chart or an outline form, you can figure out what's missing. Another thing to consider, are there secondary characters? Are there too many? Are they all developed? And that's another thing that's pretty easy to search and find. When does this Tina person come in? And at what point does she come in? And what do we really learn about her each time? In my book, I had 2 characters that were meant to show certain things, but they could have been condensed to one, and that's eventually what happened because one of them just kind of stalled out. And so I just made the 2 people one. Same thing can be done in terms of plot. Maybe one of your readers said something didn't make sense or is out of order. Again, plot lines is chapter by chapter a pretty easy thing to do on the computer. You can make little graphs, charts, any kind of tools that are just kind of going to help you get into it in a new light. If just sitting down and reading is not helping you out to make big changes, you can track backstories this way. On using writing software, I'm not really going to get into that because I don't use it. So I don't know anything about writing software. I did try to use writing software one time and it didn't work out. So I think that a lot of the programs that are out there probably have a lot of good tools too. But again, not something in my expertise. So another task we writers do not like is writing a synopsis. And I hate it, and I try never to do it, but it can be a very helpful tool during your editing process, obviously with things like plot, if you just sit down. It actually helps too when you get to that business level and you have to try to pitch or you have to try to, it's like our most dreaded question, right? What's your book about? And you're just like, oh, if I could really tell you what it's about, but you can't. They want to know anyway. But that's the synopsis, and it'll help you when you get to that level when you have to kind of start condensing it to send queries and pitches. It's all very helpful. It's easy to see the book from the forest level rather than the trees once you start breaking it down. You may notice that one chapter pretty much serves the same purpose as another chapter, and it can be done away with. Again, those bigger edits that are kind of hard to make, but if you're looking to assess the mood and character of the writing itself, another method I would recommend is reading chapters out of order. When you read chapters out of order, it kind of disrupts the flow of the story. It frees you to focus just on the 10 pages that you're going to take with you wherever. I would think of the chapter as a short story. Every chapter should kind of be its own complete little jewel also. Think of it like a short story almost, and what expectations you would have if it was one. It's not going to be as complete as a short story, but you can certainly apply some of that thinking to it. I like to do this technique obviously with printed pages because you can extract the chapter right out, and there's something symbolic about that. I'm only going to deal with what's on these 10 pages and really look at it. I like lists. I like to make lists of things. In my old editing technique, I would bring papers, notes, and have all these things all around me, and it would just be a big mess and not much got done. Now I just really like to sit down for the day with one exact task of something I'm going to do. Be organized, break down the process into achievable tasks. I'm going to talk for a second about reading because you have to do the little mini lecture about reading. It always throws me for a loop when an aspiring writer says, well, I don't have much time for reading. Now, it's true that, I learned to write by reading, and maybe there are other ways, but I can't imagine not having reading as a foundation. It's not only to improve your skills, but so that you know what's out there too. And there's going to be so many things that you are, if you're a big reader, you're going to just inherently know. This is also important, like I said, as this writer, as entrepreneur time, when many people are creating and packaging and promoting and selling their own work. When it comes to editing, much of it happens in a way that almost can't be explained, and if you read a lot of books, you know innately about things like beats and rhythm and sentence variation. If you read voraciously, your vocabulary will increase anyway, and you'll immediately know a little more about story and pace and what makes a character engaging. So you can also learn a lot about writing and editing from books about writing and editing, but I wouldn't overdo it. After some time, they can almost give you conflicting messages, but it is good, as it's good to talk to other people, go to conferences and things. It's always good to pick up a book about editing once in a while and get some new tricks. You should never stop being open to that. I have a handout over there that you're welcome to that has some books listed that are some of my favorite books on writing and editing, and also I asked a lot of my writer friends, and so it's a cold list from a lot of suggestions from different writers and things that, like I said, I have a handout if you want those suggestions. So how did you get to the point when you finished the first draft of your novel? Surely when you first contemplated it, it seemed overwhelming, even impossible, but you did it word by word, sentence by sentence, chapter by chapter, right? And in the same way, you have to approach editing. You have to think of tools and methods and even tricks to yourself to get yourself to really focus on specific things. The publishing industry is not for the faint of heart, but you should stay true to that impractical, inspired part of yourself. Hold your ground when you need to. Let go of the sections, though, that no one else thinks are working. Find trusted advisors, attack each level. Learn to enjoy the process of editing for what it offers. A chance to polish and tweak, and after that final copy edit, to really finish. And once your book is published, I will advise you never, never, never look at it again. Don't read it. If you have to do a reading, then just pick one little part and just do it, and just kind of try not to think about it while you're reading it, because there will always find something to change, and it will drive you crazy. If I could open to any page right now and be like, oh, you know, I mean, I'm very proud of it, but that's what happens, right? Because we're always changing and improving. I also know that I kind of flew through this, and it was a lot of information. I condensed this down from a longer workshop. And if there's anything you want to ask, you could feel free at any time to contact me through my website. It's maryvenselwhite.com. It's easy. You can email me there if you have questions, or you want, what was the name of this or that, or whatever. I would love to hear from you. And thank you very much for having me.
Mary, thank you so much. We're going to take a break for refreshments and socializing and buying some books. Mary will be over here with her daughter. Daughter Geneva is the money changer today, so she's there to help. And Mary, I don't know if you're aware, but we have a Q&A for you after the book selling.
Share it with the other authors. What form, without publishing it in Kindle, what form of format do you
You can send just a Microsoft Word document to that person. Every Kindle has an address. It's usually the first part of your email address, like mine's mvw888, and instead of the last part, it's @kindle.com. And when you first start doing that, you have to go into, I'm trying to remember, it's been so long, you have to go into Amazon and your settings and make sure it's okay for those type of documents to come over. You just have to click something so that you can receive documents from other people and other sources than Amazon. And then, yeah, your friend can just email it right to you. And it's particularly helpful for people who kind of have it formatted too for Kindle. Maybe they're getting ready to self-publish it or something. But even your own stuff, you can just email it to yourself and it comes out on the Kindle. So.
Is that available also for a note?
I don't know. I don't know. Sorry. Is that it?
No.
Ooh, that's easy.
Thinking really hard.
Um,
How much time do you allow yourself for editing once your story is somewhat complete? I mean, do you commiserate over it for months? Or
I suppose if someone buys it, then you're done, right?
no,
I'm not trying to. I have a few finished projects, right? I have 2 finished novels, and one I've been working on for 10 years, off and on.
We have those.
I think I'm done with it. Whether someone buys it or not, I think I can't do it anymore, you know? But I don't know, I guess it just depends on your time frame, what you plan to do with it. Obviously, if you're going to self-edit, then you're going to give yourself some kind of, hopefully, calendar. I'm going to get readers, I'm going to do this. But I do think I kind of cut it out. I actually did cut things out, believe it or not. But I was going to say something about over-workshopping, because I noticed when I was in this workshop, it was a great experience. We'd go through certain stories, and I kept on with a couple women from the group afterwards, and okay, now let's send each other some more stuff. And one would say, I'm going to send this story again. This other group I'm in read it, and you guys read it, now I've read it, and now I'm going to send it again. And I just feel like at some point, cut the cord. Like, quit having this workshopped. You really don't need 25 points of view about it. 3, 4, like, good people. I have a really good friend that's a great reader that lives in Arizona that we met through Autonomy online. And she's great because we have kind of the same sensibilities. I mean, if I had to just have one, I think she would be great. But yeah, you don't need to keep. So I don't know, you kind of have to do your own time frame and make your own decisions.
When you're trying to do a self-edit, how can you balance two storylines within the same book? Your antagonist and protagonist, and your chapters are basically going back and forth between the two. One's trying to get this way, this guy's trying to stop him, and eventually at the end they're going to collide. But in editing that, what do you look for in balance? What do you look for in emphasis? Like, is one more interesting than the other?
Do you feel like they're kind of co-main characters, or is one clearly more of a main character? I know what you're talking about.
The main character is the protagonist.
Yeah.
That's the you're rooting for. But it's important to the storyline to know what the antagonist is doing and how he's coordinating his organization and the rest of the world against him to make sure he doesn't.
I guess I would say, what type of genre is it?
This is fantasy.
We were just talking about this very similar thing over at the table. And how do you, when you have two different accounts, and I was telling this gentleman that I had just read a fantasy, which is not my field, but I have a good friend that writes fantasy, and he did this thing where every chapter would go, and it was a big hit. It's I guess like a thriller. Her name's Mary Kubica, and I sat on a panel with her, and one thing after, which is from the other person's point of view, but she'll kind of go back a little into the previous.
All this is about self-editing, so is it so that we don't have to pay for an editor, or?
That's a good question. Are you really good at editing? Maybe we can pay you now. There's a level. I feel like there's a lot of people offer. I will say there's a lot of people offering editing services now for not cheap, and you definitely want to be careful. I'm afraid to say that's another question that kind of depends on what you're trying to do. If you're going to self-publish your book, then I think you should definitely research and have a good editor look at it. Because I came up on the Autonomy site, which was basically a HarperCollins site for unpublished writers, I met a lot of friends, some that are published now, some that aren't, and I've read a lot of self-published books, and I would say that 80% of them need editing, So if you're going to self-publish, I would definitely hire an editor. But in terms of trying to submit something to like a big publisher, if that's your goal, you definitely want to get it to a really good level, and you'll have to gauge yourself, I guess, with readers and stuff, what level you think you've gotten it to, if you think it's good enough to send or not.
What style book do editors commonly use nowadays for novels?
As far as like the Chicago Manual or whatever, it varies house to house, and in terms of font and even like certain choices, it kind of varies from house to house. I think it also varies kind of, and then sometimes they'll defer a little bit to the author. Kind of an interesting thing with my book, because the Autonomy site was run in England, through London. So even though it was HarperCollins, in some ways it was kind of working with a small publisher, and we had certain back and forths about certain words, like British use over this, and of course they put use, like, when it's OR, neighbor, or whatever. One of them, which you guys will appreciate, was, growing up in Lancaster, we had the Antelope Valley Fair, and when there was, like, you'd go see the cows or whatever, it was called an exhibit, right? You'd go see the exhibit, and she said, well, we don't, it should be exhibition or whatever, and I said, no, that's not what we call it, and we kind of went back and forth on that, and other, if I'm remembering correctly, other terms that were like English, but I would think in a publishing house, they'd have, there's kind of a standard, but stylistic things, people will fight to the death over the Oxford comma. I mean, I can't decide for myself. I don't know. It seems like sometimes you need it and a lot of times you don't, but I don't know.
I feel comfortable doing the mechanics of writing, the grammar and such like that, but I feel very inadequate about trying to decide whether I have developed this character, because I know this character.
Right.
And I may be reading more into
It's obvious to you.
How do I look at it myself to tell what I've done?
Well, I mean, you can try using certain tools, like I mentioned. You could, I know people talk about doing like character analysis. There's places where they'll have a list. Ask these questions about your character, you know. What's her goals? What is she, blah, blah, blah. Outside readers are good for that. They'll tell you right away if there's a character they don't like or that doesn't seem real, or I don't think they'll tell you. I've gone to book clubs with my books, and that's a lot of what people bring up. You know, when she did that, I just don't think that's something she would do. They'll start to feel like they know them too, and you can argue those points. It is hard, though. I know what you mean, because you feel like you know them, and it's very obvious to you what they're like. But outside readers, doing little, you know, tools you can find about character analysis, or even just looking at what the character does and kind of analyzing that. It's not easy, though.
About it.
It's my final comment. It's not easy.
Isn't that the truth?